Alright, YouTube, we're back, of course, talking Final Fantasy, and we're talking Magic the Gathering. We're back to look at this collaboration happening later this year, June 13th. Today, we got our first look at some of the upcoming Commander decks, four to be exact, and what their themes are, which Final Fantasy games are based off of. And also, they announced today on Twitter that they have Yoshitaka Amano on, I guess, a part of this collaboration to do some of the art or whatever, and that they're also going to announce more info tomorrow with their, like, weekly Magic the Gathering thing they do on Twitch. So they dropped this tweet earlier that says, "We couldn't do Magic the Gathering X Final Fantasy without going back to the beginning and work with an artist who inspired generations of Final Fantasy fans. Tune in tomorrow to weekly Magic the Gathering to see more from the set, Tuesday, 10 a.m. Pacific." The video itself is just doing the reveal of Yoshitaka Amano, which is pretty cool to have him on board. If you're a Final Fantasy fan, he needs no introduction, right? He's been there since the original Final Fantasy game and still does work for the series to this day, even if it's just simply doing like the logo for something as recent as Final Fantasy 16. Pretty cool to have him on board just because of who he is, right? The legacy of Yoshitaka Amano in the Final Fantasy series. I will say, me personally, I'm not like the biggest fan of Amano's style when it comes to like the art he does for Final Fantasy games. It's all subjective at the end of the day, right? I'm just more of a fan of, I guess, something that looks more direct, like the video game character itself, something like what Nomura would do. Might be a bit of a hot take, I don't really know, but I'm still glad to have Amano be a part of this collaboration, though I would also like to see Nomura, if he's not already a part of it or confirmed to be a part of it, I would like him to be a part of this, though, too, doing some of the art. Whatever's shown tomorrow with this upcoming set, we'll definitely talk about that as well. Now, as for the 4 Commander decks shown today, the themes are Final Fantasy VI, 7, 10, and 14. And I think all of those are fantastic choices, which we'll talk about a bit more as we get into the video. But like 7 speaks for itself, 14 speaks for itself, 10 is also very, very popular. I think the best-selling Final Fantasy game, maybe non-MMO. And then 6 is like the best of like the pixel art era, right? To clarify for those that maybe aren't aware, like the entirety of the Final Fantasy series, the numbered entries will be represented with this collaboration. These are just pre-built decks that you can buy and play with the Commander format in Magic the Gathering. There will also be, I think, like a set. You can just go to the store and buy like booster packs, right? Like any other card game, I believe. And it'll have cards from Final Fantasy 1 all the way to Final Fantasy 16. Today, we do have these 4 Commander decks, and we do have the lead card for each deck, and they're characters you'd expect for the game they're representing. And you also have the packaging for these, and we do get to read the cards and like see what their effects are and like what they do and shit. Also, part of this IGN article is them explaining like the mindset that went into creating each of these decks and why they chose like particular colors and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. So we'll look at some of the artwork and then we'll read the article itself. So first off, we have Terra, Herald of Hope. She requires 1 red, white, and black mono to use. She's a 3/3. She has Trance at the beginning of combat. On your turn, mill 2 cards. Terra gains flying until end of turn, which is pretty cool that it incorporates the Trance thing from Final Fantasy VI into the card itself. Whenever Terra deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 2 mana. When you do, return target creature card with power 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Here we have the packaging for the regular version of the deck, and then we also have the packaging for the Collector's Edition, which I believe the only difference between these is this one costs a lot more. I think the entire deck is also foil. And next up, of course, we have Final Fantasy VII, Cloud X Soldier, requires any 2 mana, 1 red, green, and white. He's a 4/4, he has haste. When Cloud enters, attach up to 1 target equipment you control to it. Whenever Cloud attacks, draw a card for each equipped attacking creature you control. Then if Cloud has power 7 or greater, create 2 treasure tokens. And then, of course, we have the standard packaging for this deck, and then also the Collector's Edition packaging. I do want to comment on Cloud's card really quickly, because I don't know if this is like a reskin card, because they do that with these collaborations a lot, where they take a card that already exists, and they just make it whatever the theme is, you know, whatever the collaboration is. There are original cards in these collaborations too, though, but that's just something they do. But I do like that this card, whether it's new or not, incorporates the number 7 into it, because obviously it's Final Fantasy VII. But also I like that Cloud's card has haste, and if you don't know what that is, in a Magic the Gathering, back in the day it was called Summoning Sickness. I don't know if that's what it's still called now, but whenever you like summon a creature, like you can't attack with it right away. You gotta wait till your next turn, and then you can attack with it, right? Unless the card does have haste, and that allows you to attack with it the turn you summon it. And I think that makes perfect sense for the character of Cloud, because kind of a badass, and he's about that action, right? So Cloud's down to fight right away all the time. So like I think it makes perfect sense for his card to have that. I don't remember a ton about Magic the Gathering. I do remember kind of the basics, but I don't really remember like equipment and tokens. I know what that stuff is in Magic the Gathering, but I just don't remember the ins and outs of that shit. But they do go into explain why each deck is what it is, and they do explain why, you know, the FF7 deck is like equipment themed. I don't really know why Cloud summons tokens. I mean, there is summoning FF7, but there's summoning in all the Final Fantasy games, so, you know, I don't know. Anyways, on to Final Fantasy X, we have Tidus, Yuna's Guardian. He requires 1 green, white, and blue magic. He's a 3/3. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may move a counter from target creature you control onto a second target creature you control. Cheer whenever 1 or more creatures you control with counters on them deal combat damage to a player. You may draw a card and proliferate. I don't know what the hell that is. Do this only once each turn. Quickly looking into it, it says to proliferate means to choose any number of permanents and or players that have a counter, then give each 1 additional counter of each kind that permanent or player already has. And then, of course, we have the standard packaging for the deck and the Collector's Edition packaging. They do go on to explain why there is like a counter theme when it comes to the Final Fantasy X deck, which is a little interesting. We'll talk about that when we get there, I guess. And then also I do like that they gave him cheer, which is a move you use a lot, or an ability I guess you use a lot in Final Fantasy X, especially when you get to like the end game stuff. Like if you're doing like the Dark Aeons and Penance and shit, like you generally want to like up your physical defense in a lot of those fights, and you want to use cheer like 6 times I believe it is in combat to like make those fights a little bit easier. And I believe on the sphere grid, maybe Tidus does get cheer first, if I'm not mistaken. There is also quick hit, which is like the main move you use with like every character once you get to the end game, just so you get more damaging attacks, more 99,999 hits, right? You could have maybe incorporated that into the card, but that would kind of fall maybe in like the same realm as like haste or something like that. So I don't know why you do that or how you do it exactly. Next we have Final Fantasy XIV and Yoshitaka, I don't know how you say it. Knight's Bless. She requires any 1 mana and then 1 white, blue, and black. She is a 2/4. She has Vigilance. I don't know if I know what that is until I Google it. At the beginning of each end step, if a player loses 4 or more life this turn, you draw a card. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or greater, Yoshitaka deals 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life. So looking into it really quickly, Vigilance allows a card to attack without tapping. So if you don't know anything about Magic the Gathering, whenever you attack with a creature, after it attacks, it turns sideways, and that makes it to where it can't block during your opponent's turn when they are attacking. So that's actually a pretty cool effect. So that they're able to block during your opponent's turn still after attacking. And then, yeah, you guessed it, we have the packaging for the standard edition of the deck and the collector's edition of the deck. Exciting stuff. So kind of similar to Final Fantasy VI, why I didn't really talk about that game either, or that card. Like, I don't really know much about those games, so I don't know if, like, this card's effects kind of incorporate anything from Final Fantasy XIV into them. I have no idea, because they're just games I'm not well versed in. So let's hop into the IGN article. Set to launch this June, Magic's Final Fantasy crossover will be a fully draftable standard legal set accompanied by the 4 pre-constructed decks in the gallery above. Each of those includes 100 cards made up of both reprints of existing cards with new Final Fantasy arts and brand new cards designed with Magic's most popular format, Commander, in mind. And while Commander precons are always themed around certain characters, colors, or strategies, the twist with these is that each one is built around a single Final Fantasy game, specifically 6, 7, 10, and 14. Final Fantasy games are so rich with flavor, beloved characters, and unique settings that choosing a single game as a theme provided more than enough material to design a full deck of cards around, says senior game designer Daniel Holt, who is the commander lead for the set. Approaching each deck as a single game also provided the opportunity to dive deep into the lore of each, capturing even more beloved moments from across the game's storyline that we may not have been able to achieve otherwise. So that does make a ton of sense, right? Because if you're trying to incorporate like multiple of the Final Fantasy games into each deck, you can only do so much of each game, right? So if you theme it around one single game, you can do the entire set, all 100 cards, is about Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy X, right? And then with the upcoming booster set, you can incorporate, multiple cards from each individual game. But it's kind of nice that you can have like one individual theme when it comes to the Commander decks, right? So like that's what I'm here for, is the Final Fantasy VII cards, and I do want some Final Fantasy 10 cards, of course, and other stuff like that. But it's nice that I can go out there and buy this one Final Fantasy VII Commander deck, and it's all Final Fantasy VII themed cards. The team decided on these 4 Final Fantasy games based on a balance of what they wanted for the gameplay of each deck and how well known each story was overall. Holt says that while Final Fantasy VII and 14 were clearer picks, 6 and 10 took more discussion to arrive at, but were chosen partially because they were favorites among the team. This was one of those products where everyone in the building was invested in each stage of development, as we have so many passionate Final Fantasy fans in the building. I do talk about it a bit more later why they chose the specific games for these decks or whatever. I do find it a little bit interesting that obviously 7 and 14 make sense. They're very, very popular Final Fantasy games. It's kind of interesting that they were unsure what to do with the next 2, whether or not it'd be 6, 10, or some other Final Fantasy games, just because, again, 10 is very, very popular. I believe it's the best-selling Final Fantasy game of all time, individual, anyways. Maybe non-MMO, again, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, it's pretty obvious if you were to ask me, what games should we build individual decks around, I'd probably say 7, 10, and 14, and I'm not even a 14 fan. I have played the game, it's fun for what it is, but it's not one of my favorite Final Fantasy games of all time, but I do know how popular it is, and if you're trying to sell this product, 7, 10, and 14 makes sense. Of course, even within those picks, there are some decisions you have to make about direction. For instance, Final Fantasy VII's remake trilogy has been running alongside the development of this Magic set. So is its Commander precon telling the story of the original, or its reality-bending reimagining? Dylan Devaney, principal narrative game designer at Wizards of the Coast and narrative lead for the set, says you'll see a bit of both throughout the deck's art, but the story itself will follow the 1997 classic. So this is part of why I wanted to read this article, because it actually explained the decks themselves, and it's kind of nice to know that with the FF7 themed deck, it is following the original game's story, but you will have artwork from the original game and also aspects of the remake trilogy. But it's kind of cool to know that, like, when you buy the deck, you'll have, artwork from, like, the beginning, middle, and probably end of the game, right? Because it's following the story of the game. So we can probably expect, locations, monsters, people, whatever, from kind of any aspect of, from the beginning of FF7 to the end. Which is pretty cool. I want to see it stay for Sephiroth card. It better be in here. Our core approach to Final Fantasy VII was to capture the original PS1 game's narrative while using Final Fantasy VII Remake and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's modern aesthetics to push the fidelity of each character design, story moments, and memorable location to the next level, Devaney explains. With that in mind, if a scene existed in both games, we had our choice of showing it as the original game did, how the modern version interpreted it, or a unique fusion of both. Hopefully this deck feels familiar and nostalgic to players of both the original game and the modern series. Speaking of nostalgia, Final Fantasy VI is a trickier nut to crack in some ways, as it lacks some more modern art references the other three games can provide. Definitely says they want to stick close to what fans would expect from its pixel art sprites and limited concept art, while also expanding upon them, in hopes that the character designs should feel like how you remember them, despite being a hybridization of many different references and new ideas. To help accomplish that, Wizards of the Coast even consulted directly with the Final Fantasy VI team as they updated these characters to the standards needed for Magic art. We developed a workflow that asked concept artists and card artists to pull hallmark character designs from Yoshitaka Amano's original and legendary concept art, the original FF6 sprites, and the FF6 pixel remaster character portraits to synthesize the most consistent elements of each character's design into something new. We also encourage our artists to punch up finer details and Beasts explore the fuck elements where they thought they could push, fabric, patterns, textures, etc. Then we could meet with the Final Fantasy VII 6 review team. They would give us feedback on what core elements they wanted to preserve and what new elements they were excited about. I do actually like that they consulted with the Final Fantasy VI dev team or whatever, whoever that was, I'm not entirely sure, and got like kind of their feedback on the card art. That's pretty interesting. I will say in terms of like, at least like Terra, she is in Dissidia NT, which gives you like a good like 3D depiction of the character. That's something you could have pulled from if they didn't already. So they had the 4 games decided, but when it comes to Commander, that's only half the equation. Wizards of the Coast also need to figure out which characters would lead each deck. Cloud may be the obvious pick for 7, but Holt tells me the others involve some brainstorming. Celeste was considered for 6 since the deck is focused around the World of Ruin and second half of the game, while Yuna was considered for 10 as a fan favorite. They ultimately decided to stick with the lead characters on those, but Final Fantasy XIV is an MMO, which presented its own problem. So I mean, I think it makes perfect sense that you would do the lead characters of each game as like the lead of the deck, right? I mean, that makes perfect sense. I don't know why you do something different. Like when it comes to 10, I understand the idea of like using Yuna, because while you are Tidus in the game, that's the player character, that's the main character you control, the story is just as much Yuna's as it is Tidus's, right? You're going on the pilgrimage for her in the final Aeon, defeating Sin, all that other shit, right? So you can make an argument that she's just as important to the story as Tidus, if not more so, but you are playing as Tidus the entire game. So, like, obviously that should be the lead of the deck. For Yoshitaka, it came down to a mix of popularity of the character as well as being a spellcaster. Her story and character development offered a wide range of abilities and moments to pull from to lead the deck, Holt explains. Going on to say the deck represents her specifically during her Shadowbringers arc. They did explore the concept of making a Warrior of Light commander players could make their own in some fashion, but Holt says those ideas had some pretty in-depth executions, and that your own personal hero still has plenty of moments in this deck, even without being at the helm. Now comes the question of figuring out how to fit an entire video game story, characters, and themes into a single deck, and the carefully balanced restrictions of Magic's 5 colors. Building these decks call for us to decide color identity for the chosen game itself, but also the gameplay we desired from them, says Holt, going on to point out that it's no mistake all 4 include white, for both theming and it helped cover the wide range of heroes we want to include in each deck. I do kind of like that explanation too, because I think white Magic, when it comes to Magic the Gathering, is meant to be like the good guy Magic, essentially. It's actually what I used to use back in the day. It was like my main deck when I used to play with the boys. And it's kind of nice that they incorporate that into each of these Commander decks, because they're all, you know, good guy, good heroes or whatever, right? Cloud, Tidus, Yoshitaka, Terra. As mentioned, the deck for 6 is centered on the latter half of that game. As such, it's essentially all about rebuilding your party by bringing other creatures back from your graveyard. For 7, Cloud wielding a big sword lines up nicely with the equipment strategies of a white-red Magic deck, but Holt says that adding green to the mix let us tie in the Power Matters cards that reference the planet and the live stream. If we look back at the cover for the packaging of this deck, you can see that the color for it is red, green, and white. And it's nice that the green, I guess, is meant to represent the planet and the live stream when it comes to FF7, which I think is a nice little detail. While Tidus' ability to pass counters around might lead you to think the deck for 10 is all about Blitzball, this classic white-blue-green strategy actually primarily came from the idea of that game's sphere grid leveling system as a way to empower your creatures. Holt also admits that the theme for 14 was tricky to land on, but its white-blue-black color identity allowed them to lean into a non-creature spell casting theme while also including the characters they wanted to. It is kind of interesting when you look back at the Tidus card that we read earlier, that the passing around of counters is actually meant to be a reference to the sphere grid, which does make some sense because you can kind of hop around and do whatever you want depending on the kind of spheres that you have in your inventory, right? I think it could also work for Blitzball to a certain degree, but I guess sphere grid makes sense. Last but not least, Commander might be all about your leader, but RPGs are often about your party as a whole, and Wizards of the Coast won't leave the supporting cast of these games hanging. Final Fantasy games are full of lovable and villainous characters, and getting them in these decks was very important, Holt says. While I can't talk specifics on who is included in each deck or their abilities just yet, fans can expect to see some of their favorite characters in the 99 of each deck as new legendary creatures and capture in action on other exciting spells. So that's not really a surprise, but it is good to have that confirmation that you can probably expect the rest of like the party members from their respective games, right? While you see Cloud on the cover of that specific deck and Tidus on the cover of that specific deck, you can probably expect, you know, Waka and Yuna and, you know, Tifa and Barrett and stuff with the other decks, right? Also the villains, because we've already seen, like, you know, the Kefka card and a Sephiroth card. Whether or not there's more of each of those characters, I don't know. Magic's Final Fantasy set will release on June 13th, and if you don't see your personal favorite Final Fantasy game or character here, or even if you do, don't worry, Holt assures me that all 16 of the mainline games will have their moments to shine in the accompanying products. And now we get to the worst part of the info, the damn price. Returning to the same territory as the Warhammer 40k Commander decks from 2022, all 4 of these decks will be available in both a regular version, $70, and a collector's edition, $150. The latter of which will feature all 100 of the cards in each deck in a special Surge foil treatment. I'll be honest, I don't know shit about Magic the Gathering. I don't know shit about the normal prices of Commander decks, dude. But $70 just for the standard version? That's insanity. I'm 100% not buying that. I'm only buying this stuff for like a collector's thing, right? And I'm going to bust it open, put it in my binder, and I'll probably use some of the cooler card art and stuff like that for like tokens and Yu-Gi-Oh! When I play that shit with the boys. $70 is insane, dude. When a new like structure deck comes out for Yu-Gi-Oh, the shit is $10. And sometimes you got to buy 3 of it to get like, 3 copies of like the best cards in the deck. So like you can go out and buy 3 of those decks, and they can be a somewhat competitive deck for $30 for less than half of what one of these Commander decks cost, dude. That's fucking insane. I mean, personally, I'll probably be buying like individual cards that I want from these decks that I think are cool, like the Tidus card, the Cloud card, things like that, as opposed to spending $70 goddamn dollars. Bro, that's a new video game. That's video game prices for a fucking trading card deck. Like, God, dude, what has happened? That's not the Magic I knew. Don't get me wrong, I'm still very much interested in this collaboration. I'm 100% buying a bunch of these cards, but it's going to be on this secondary market from vendors on TCG Player. But dudes, that is indeed going to be the video. It is astronomically longer than I planned on it being. And there is more to the article itself if you want to read it. We read over like IGN's like recap of the interview and the info and stuff. But below where we stopped reading at, they actually have the question and answer section if you want to read that yourself. It'll, of course, be linked in the description below. We're just going to wrap it up, and tomorrow we'll talk about whatever info we get from like the live stream thing that they do for this collaboration. Anyways, that's the video. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new. Search for the description below. Follow me on Twitter, @YT. That's it. And it blurs. Bye.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.